Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another installment in our Reviewed and Ranked series. We are just about done with the X-Men characters, but with just a few more to get through, it's time for us to talk about a very unique character within the Marvel canon, and particularly within the cast of characters that we've looked at up until this point. I, of course, am speaking about the man from the future, Cable. Now, Cable is very odd in terms of how he works, and that's just kind of based off of his power set, which is faithful in this representation. I think they did a really good job of bringing the functions of this character to the game, but how does it hold up against the rest of the cast? That's what we're here to find out. As we jump into this breakdown, make sure you check to see if you're subscribed to the channel. If you're not, go ahead and fix that for me real quick, as there is daily variety content headed your way. And if you find today's video helpful, interesting, and or enjoyable, make sure that you hit that like button. So, let's start where we always do with these characters by talking about the team build synergies that Cable possesses. He actually has 6 different synergies across 5 of the different classes, so not the most well-rounded character as far as we've seen in our character breakdowns, but still a bunch of desirable traits. He has 1 strength synergy with X-Men, 1 vitality synergy with X-Force, 2 defense synergies with family values and heavy metal, 1 energy synergy with team leaders, and 1 mastery synergy with sharp shooters. So a fairly even spread, and the one area that he does double down on is the defense synergy, which isn't the most highly valued synergy in my book, but there can be some benefit to having some resistance to damage that you receive from your opponents. So I can't write it off completely. I just don't value the defense synergies as highly as I do the mastery, energy, and strength synergies. But he has those as well, so fairly well-rounded, all things considered. Moving on to talk about the base functions of Cable's kit, we have the standard attack sequence. Now, Cable will fire off 3 pretty high-power blasts from his rifle, and they deal a decent amount of damage, as well as having the perk of preventing retaliation from the smaller grunt type characters, which is fairly unique amongst the range type characters, though I don't think that they're as powerful as they necessarily could be to really be something to be scared or concerned about. And they are beefy shots that have a decent amount of delay one between the other, making it one of the slower basic attack sequences in the game. And if you're looking for more raw power in those basic attacks, there are certainly members of the roster that fill that role a little bit better. Cable's heavy attack is unique in its own right. It is one of the few, if not the only, heavy attacks that can be charged, and the longer you charge it, the more powerful it becomes. Basically, he has that biomechanical arm that will grow in size and then will lunge out forward in an open palm strike that deals a fair amount of damage into the opponents that it connects with, as well as pushing back the grunt type characters in that vicinity. Now, as much as I appreciate having a chargeable heavy attack, there are obvious drawbacks to that, as it leaves Cable open to retaliation from his opponents, and that's not always a great thing, especially when you have limited options and resources for attacking into your opponents. He does have a couple of things that can circumvent this, but we'll talk about those when we get down to the abilities that he has. Cable is one of the final characters that we will be looking at that has a teleport on his double jump. And by all standards, it's a fairly slow teleport. It's a decent option for getting around the battlefield, but if you're looking for speed, there's no one better than Nightcrawler in terms of how quickly you can repeat the teleportations as they go through. And I'm not even going to put them up side by side because Nightcrawler is very clearly faster, and drawing that type of comparison this late into the series just isn't really worth my time. Just know that Cable has this utility, but if you're looking for speed and traveling between combat sections, he's not the best pick out of the roster. Cable's falling aerial is a concussive blast. It's a small little energy beam that is emitted from Cable's eye and it will land down on the ground and explode and deal a decent amount of damage there. And I do think that that is better than a couple of other falling aerial attacks that we've seen, because it does have a very finite focal point, but based off of the fact that it does have that concussive blast upon impacting the ground or the opponent that it strikes, this does make it a much better falling aerial than a couple of the other ones that we've seen up until this point. But again, the downside of this falling aerial is Cable does not have an ability that he can use that would organically put him into this state, so really you're only going to see it as an engagement tool as you're approaching a group of opponents, and even then it's not super great because there are better strategies that you can use with Cable to line up larger amounts of damage against your opponents. And Cable's block and dodge animation involves him conjuring up an energy barrier out in front of his character to mitigate incoming attacks and blows. And as he moves out of the way of those incoming attacks, he does perform that combat roll, which again is always something that I really enjoy seeing. It doesn't factor into the ranking a whole lot, but it definitely is something that I prefer to see, especially among the members of the cast that are more nimble. Now, let's pivot over and talk a little bit about Cable's abilities. And first off, we have an ability that sounds fairly impressive based off of the name, that being Extreme Arsenal. However, it's fairly lackluster in its applications. It doesn't have a very long duration in terms of how it sticks around. It's around for a couple of seconds before it dissipates back around. You can only have one of these active at a time, and I do want to mention that I know that there is a glitch present where you can have two of these Extreme Arsenal rifles present at the same time, but it's not optimal whatsoever because it requires you being struck while you are trying to activate the ability. You need to be knocked down by an opponent, so it's incredibly circumstantial. It requires a lot of unnecessary setup, and you're taking hits that you really don't need to be taking in order to fully execute that. So, is it kind of cool that it exists? Sure, but this is probably the worst ability in terms of attacking that Cable has in his entire arsenal. So, just use other options in his kit when it comes to dealing that damage. Now, there can be some benefits to lining up this attack with his second ability, which we'll talk about in just a brief moment. But all things considered, it's just pretty lackluster and has terrible stats to boot. This ability has the energy attack type and the beam synergy trait, and like I said, it's very bad in terms of the other stats, possessing an F classification to damage and stagger damage dealt, and a D classification to energy points consumed. So not only does it use a lot of energy points, it doesn't get you a lot of benefit with the points that it does consume. As this attack is ranked up, it does at least have the option of having increased attack damage, increased damage dealt to the stagger gauge, an increase to the duration of the ability being active, and finally the reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. Cable's second ability is the Gravity Bomb, and this is actually quite an interesting ability for Cable to possess. He will fire out an explosive charge that will draw in the surrounding enemies. It will draw them in and hold them in a centralized location for about 4 seconds, and then at the end it does explode, and it deals a decent amount of damage when doing so, having a B classification to the damage dealt, even though it only has a D classification to the staggered damage it deals, and has a decent ranking of C for the energy points consumed when using this ability. Although it cannot be synergized, it does have the energy attack type, and this is a very unique move within the cast. There's only one other character that we have not yet talked about that has any sort of gravity type ability, and although their ability is far better, I still think that this is the move that works best in Cable's collective kit as being his DLC privilege move, as it was definitely the first move that we saw that had any sort of gravity affecting ability in terms of drawing all of your opponents in. And not only does it deal damage upon the explosion, it does also allow for follow-ups from the rest of your team, and works on mighty enemies as well as the grunt type enemies, though it doesn't do anything against the mini bosses, which just kind of makes sense because that would be way too powerful of a characteristic for that ability if it did possess it. Now, like I mentioned, you can kind of set up the extreme arsenal to fire directly forward into this gravity bomb, and it'll give you some additional damage onto the opponents that are within that field, but you're better off using other attack types or abilities from Cable or other members of your party to get better damage there. With this ability, as it's ranked up, it has the energy point cost reduced, it has an increase to the attack damage dealt, an increase to the stagger damage dealt, and finally that reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. Cable's third ability is purely defensive. It is the Tech Shield, and that is an ability that blocks attacks and reflects beams coming in from team members and can be held down for as long as you want, as long as you have the energy points to use it. And as you rank this ability up, it has a reduced energy point cost at each individual rank up. So you can get to the point where you can hold on to this for quite some time. Now, it can be synergized as the Safeguard ability, which is a little bit better than Captain America's Absolute Defense because it protects Cable from all sides instead of just being directly in front of the character. So, a decent amount of utility and practicality there when it comes to the synergy aspect of it, but that's really the only time that you're ever going to see this used within combat because you're better off layering in damage to your opponents rather than using this defensively to get around a couple of the hazards that you'll inevitably run into throughout the quest. Cable's fourth and final ability is the TK Spike, and this is an area of effect attack that's similar to some of the burst type abilities that we've seen from opponents, and it probably would have the burst synergy trait if it were able to be synergized. However, this ability works very differently in the sense that it can be charged over a period of time and increase in intensity, but if you hold on to the ability for too long, then Cable actually receives a negative status effect in terms of having a reduced defense, and he burns out, and it has a kind of a stagger animation that takes place, and then he has that reduced defense for about a 10-second time frame. So as powerful as this ability can be, you've just got to be sensitive to the timing of it, because if not, you're going to end up taking more damage from your opponents, and that's never really a good position to be placed in. If this didn't have the chance to give a negative status effect, it probably would have been a strong contender for the DLC privilege move within Cable's kit, but the gravity bomb just has better application and doesn't have the chance to inflict a negative status effect upon the character if it's executed inefficiently. That being said, it will discourage attacks from the grunt type characters because as long as they are within the field of that spike effect, it will prevent them from getting in any closer. And upon the attack finalizing, whether you release the button or reach the maximum timing, it will send those characters flying backward as well. This ability has the energy attack type and has Cs across the board in terms of damage, stagger damage, and energy points consumed. And as the ability ranks, and as you rank the ability up, it has the familiar characteristics of reduced energy point cost and increase to the attack damage, increase to stagger damage dealt, and that reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. Now, Cable's extreme ability is fairly straightforward. It involves a series of those extreme arsenal autonomous guns being brought in, and they will point down into a singular focal point, similar to how Iron Man's extreme attack work, with the biggest difference being it just focuses in on that singular point instead of kind of a conical focus towards that central location. While those autonomous guns are firing in on that spot, he will charge up a powerful shot with his blaster and then unleash that at the move's peak, and everything wraps up in about 4.5 seconds, making it a decently quick attack and a fair option for attacking into boss type characters, but I still think that there are a lot of other characters in the roster that are better with their extreme attacks, especially when it comes to dealing damage to the bosses. And again, we have the standard caution with this where Cable will just activate this ability wherever he's standing. He doesn't course correct or move in on his opponents and cannot readjust. He will just carry out the entirety of the attack as soon as it is activated directly out in front of him. So something that may be beneficial to do is to activate a gravity bomb before or immediately before using your extreme attack, as that will draw in more opponents into that central focal point. So now that we've looked at everything that Cable has to offer, we need to determine where he belongs on our tier list. And as cool of a character as he is, and as niche as some of his abilities are and unique to him, that doesn't really save him when it comes to his overall applications. I actually think that he's fairly lackluster, and that's somewhat problematic, because he really should be a character that specializes in burning down some of the opponents with higher efficiency, but he sadly just does not have that as he really should. Some things that I think would make him a little bit better is if that extreme arsenal ability had more damage, or even if it had a longer duration. I know that it had a longer duration as a part of its rank up, but it's still not around for very long. So you would either need to increase the amount of damage that it does, or increase the amount of time that the weapon is present in order to really give it any sort of benefit. And honestly, I feel like that TK spike just has a really unfortunate reduction to Cable's defense, and I understand the premise of that being an attack, but it's the first and only time that we see something like that in the entire roster. So did you really have to mess him over that badly? I just think that it would have been better if that were kind of written out of it. Or if you do want to keep that kind of a detriment to using that ability, you've got to make it significantly stronger than what it is in order for it to warrant that type of a concussive blowback on the user. So where do I feel like Cable belongs? Honestly, I feel like he ranks fairly low. I think that the highest I'm willing to put him is right here in front of Spider-Man. I think Iron Man still has a couple of things that make him a little bit better, especially where he has attacks that can automatically hone in on his opponents. So we're going to move some of these characters around and place Cable between Spider-Man and Iron Man on his tier list. But the good news is that he did manage to outclass his old man Cyclops, who is at the bottom of B tier. But what do you think? Do you think that I've been a little too hard on Cable? Do you think that there's things that I missed or didn't take into consideration? Be sure to let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. If you've made it this far and you've enjoyed the video, make sure that you leave that like, and don't forget to subscribe for the daily variety content. Thanks again for watching, and I hope that you have an absolutely fantastic rest of your day.